Okay, so we're going to start our unit on 4.3, which is all about carbon cycling. So you'll recall from unit 4.2, we were talking about energy flow, and energy cannot be recycled. So all the energy that we use has to be continually added to a system. You're finding that out from your mesocosms. If we're not constantly adding sunlight, the producers can't produce anything. And remember that the sun is primary source of energy, and that light energy is captured by your producers, which is then the basis for every food chain and food web. So in contrast, nutrients can and are recycled, in contrast to energy, which cannot be recycled. So we're going to be following the cycling of carbon, which is the exchange of carbon between both the biotic, which are the living, and the abiotic parts of the ecosystem. So the abiotic are the non-living parts. And so this is just sort of an overview of what the entire carbon cycle looks like. But, why do we care about the cycling of carbon in the first place? Well, we're so interested in this is because carbon is the backbone of all of our organic molecules. So we are carbon-based life forms, and maybe you haven't heard that outside the context of, say, a sci-fi movie, but carbon is the backbone of all of our important organic macromolecules. If you think back to, like, say, your nucleic acids, right? You guys have been drawing nucleotides since the beginning of the year. So you will recognize your phosphate here being attached to a pentose sugar, and at every one of these corners is a carbon. So similarly, our energy molecules, so carbohydrates, which are our sugars, and lipids are the fats. So every single corner here is a carbon, and they're written explicitly here in this triglyceride here. So our lipids and, our sugars, the things that make food so delicious, are carbon-based molecules. And similarly, our proteins, right? So these guys have effectively a carbon chain. So these two carbons are always present in each amino acid, and you have this carbon group that's attached to each one. So no matter which kind of biomolecule you're talking about, all of them are based on carbon, which is why we care about it so much in biology. So there's just a couple of vocabulary terms I want to introduce you to, that of reservoir and flux. So a reservoir, or you might hear it referred to as a sink, so just know both these words. So a reservoir and a sink just means a place where something is stored. And because we're talking about the carbon cycle, a carbon sink or a carbon reservoir is just a place where carbon is stored, right? And so there are a lot of different places within the carbon cycle that you will find it. So in all living things, in plants and animals, because we all have DNA, we all have proteins, we all have those carbohydrates and lipids, we all are therefore storage places of carbon. There's carbon in the atmosphere, and there's going to be carbon in decomposing plants and animals. It's in the soil, it's certainly in those fossil fuels, and all these other places that we're going to talk about more in depth later. So those are the places where carbon is stored. So that's the reservoir or the sink. But flux is a different word. Maybe you haven't heard it quite yet. So flux refers to movement. And in the context of a carbon cycle, we're referring to processes that move carbon from one reservoir to another. So like we breathe in oxygen and we breathe out carbon dioxide. So that would be one way that carbon is being moved from one reservoir to another. The other ones that you'll have to be familiar with are like photosynthesis, combustion, fossilization, and feeding. So we'll talk about all of these in depth in a minute. So I just wanted to give you that terminology now so you're not like freaking out about what is a reservoir and what is flux later. Okay. So in your notes, I have a blank piece of paper for you to draw the terrestrial carbon cycle, and I'm just sort of showing you the whole thing now so that you can, sort of plan your drawing out before we go through it. Okay. So how I tend to think of these things is I just tend to start with the atmospheric CO2. Okay, so we have carbon dioxide in the air that you're breathing right now. Most of it is actually nitrogen, and there's some oxygen in there, or all of us would be dead, but okay. There's going to be some amount of atmospheric carbon dioxide. And I'm going to start with the most important process, and that is the carbon dioxide that is taken up by our producers and autotrophs. So these guys are super important, again, in all our food webs and food chains, but they are also very important in taking up that CO2 through a process of photosynthesis. And as we all know, plants use carbon dioxide plus light and water to make glucose, which ends up feeding all the rest of the organisms in the ecosystems, right? So producers capture atmospheric CO2 and using photosynthesis make that delicious glucose, which is then taken up by consumers in a process of feeding. So these two are examples of carbon flux. Photosynthesis is moving carbon from the atmosphere to the producers. It's being fixed in the form of glucose, and then feeding is a separate flux, right? It's transferring glucose, that carbon in the glucose, from the producer to the consumer. And these guys are both carbon sinks or reservoirs. So if you're a bunny or you're a human, one thing that you will also do if you're breathing right now is that you're conducting a process called respiration. So in respiration, when you inhale, you're breathing oxygen. When you exhale, you're breathing CO2. And every time that we do that, we are adding more carbon dioxide to that atmospheric pool. Now, just a note to impress this upon you is that plants also use cellular respiration. So they also take in oxygen from the surrounding area, and they will expel CO2 as a means of burning energy. It's just that they are creating that first with photosynthesis. Okay, so plants and animals both basically breathe out and add CO2 to the atmosphere. So over time, something sad happens, and that both plants and animals will eventually die and eventually undergo a process called decomposition. So the other thing is that, especially if you've ever had plants, everybody poops, right? So this is known as egestion. So not all the feeding that goes on, not all those materials are used, and what is left over is discarded as waste. Either way, whether it's decomposition or waste, they go to your decomposers, right? So your bacteria, your earthworms, all those guys. So once it's with the decomposers, they can either break down that carbon into simpler molecules and return it to the soil. That's the majority of what they're doing. But again, these are the saprotrophic bacteria and fungi. So this is the specific class of bacteria that is involved with decomposition. And bacteria, just like plants and just like animals, will use aerobic cellular respiration. So they're going to basically take in oxygen while they're doing this decomposing, and then release CO2 again directly to the atmosphere, again contributing to that atmospheric CO2. So that's what bacteria will do when there's oxygen available. But not all material, not all places have a lot of oxygen. So there's a separate class, and we'll talk about these guys in depth in a minute. The methanogens, which are a class of archaea, if you remember that they are one of the 3 domains of life, and they operate in anaerobic or in no oxygen conditions at all. So when they decompose these, remains or waste where there is no oxygen, they too will end up eventually leading to a release of carbon dioxide back to the atmosphere. But not all decomposition is complete, so sometimes materials will escape both the saprotrophic bacteria and the methanogens, and when that happens, and you let millions of years go by and you put those materials under pressure, you will eventually end up with fossil fuels. So the bus or car that you took over, this morning to school was fueled by the dead or decaying remains of animals and plants from millions of years ago. And when we, take that and put that into our factories or our cars and we burn that through, we're going to use a fancy word for that, is combustion. So that is also going to contribute to the atmospheric pool of CO2. And it's actually kind of a problem how much of the CO2 that we're pumping out due to combustion is kind of overloading our system and destabilizing our ecosystems. Okay, so the most important part of the carbon cycle is probably going to be photosynthesis. It has like an outsized role. And I just want to emphasize that it's not just plants that do photosynthesis. So if you think back to our classification lab, the algae and cyanobacteria, those single-celled little dudes, like you can probably still see them on the right side of the room on the shelf. It's sort of that blue-green algae. Those are cyanobacteria, and if it's green, it has chlorophyll in it, and it's able to do photosynthesis. So any of these types of organisms, and we'll learn about a different class in when we start talking about the ocean ecosystems in a minute. So plants, algae, and cyanobacteria, all three of them can do photosynthesis. And what they do is they're going to take that CO2, that carbon dioxide that's in the atmosphere, and they're going to, with sunlight and water, create glucose, which is that, sixth ring sugar, that carbohydrate, and then as a waste product, they release oxygen. So this is the most important part. It is the only one that is going to provide energy for other living organisms. Without the producers, nothing else could survive. It's also the only process that is going to remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. So keeping our plants and our cyanobacteria healthy and happy is critical for CO2 removal. Okay, so the flip side of photosynthesis, and it really is a reverse reaction, is that instead of creating glucose, it's taking glucose and it's breaking it down. So it's literally a reverse. So in photosynthesis, we take carbon dioxide and we make glucose and oxygen, and in respiration, we're taking glucose and then we're breaking it down into CO2 and ATP. And this process requires oxygen. So it's going to return CO2 to the atmosphere, and not just animals use it. So we tend to think of it in terms of ourselves, but animals and plants both use respiration, as well as those bacteria that are doing decomposition. So all three use respiration, and so all three are going to be breathing out that carbon dioxide. So okay, here again is just your summary of the carbon cycle.